Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Smart in the Round from the SMART program. As some of you know, Smart in the Round is a series of conversations on creativity, culture, and our context, where we try to bring together themes that concern us and our artistic communities. Today, we have a very, very special episode where we're going to discuss the ideas of consent in intimate practices such as theater and dance that bring ourselves close, not just physically, but also emotionally, and the way in which we create work, teach work, as well as rehearse and share our work with the public. In these intimate spaces, what happens to the idea of consent? What happens to the boundaries, the trust? How do we together make spaces that are safe, brave, and nurturing for ourselves and with those who we build work together? Before we begin this conversation with the three experts that we have for today, a few house rules. There is a chat box where you can tell us your suggestions, you can put your comments, you can share your experiences with the audience and with us. But in case you have questions, and we are going to have a separate time kept for questions, you have a Q&A box where I request you to put your questions there. We are not just doing this on Zoom. This has gone live on the SMART Facebook page as well. And if you are watching us on Facebook, please put your questions in the comments box. And there's somebody who's going to let us know what those questions are. If you have questions that are specific to one of our experts today, please do mention that as well. We hope today's discussion is not just going to attempt to deal with some of the solutions, some of the issues that we faced in dealing with ideas of consent in our practices, but also open up space for new understanding, new thinking, ways in which we can bring ourselves together to keep building on how we make our work. We have three experts with us today. We have Mandeep Raikhy, who's a dancer, choreographer, teacher of dance. We have Sharanya Ramprakash, who's a theater maker, actor, director. And we have Neha Vyas, who's an intimacy director and an artist. Coming from diverse backgrounds, having worked in very different contexts, they will share not just their experiences, but also the challenges they face and some of the thoughts that they have in building spaces for the future for artists. I would like to thank the Goethe Institute, Max Muller Bhavan, Delhi, for supporting SIR and SMART this session. And this program is in partnership with India Foundation for the Arts. So let us begin. I wanted to begin with a question, like a rapid fire question to all our panelists, all three panelists. When did you, in your practice, for the first time, encounter the idea of consent?
Okay, so, okay, I'll take this one. Go first. It was in a bar in KR Market, and I was up there with a bunch of sex workers and trans people, and we were drinking, we were having a good time, and it was just a specific place, a very safe space where only trans people and sex workers are there, and we were sitting there singing, talking, and at a time when it became open for customers, this man came up to me and asked me what was my rate, and for me it was the first time I realized that I had never thought of it before. I never realized that my body actually had a negotiation. And it was sort of, for me, it felt safe that time. And it was sort of felt like a respectful question. And I think it was the first time I encountered consent.
Thanks, Sharanya. Mandeep?
For me, an early kind of encounter with consent was a moment when a dancer during the making of a work, Mayland Has Straight Anthony, came up to me and said she wasn't comfortable with the way another dancer was touching her in a particular duet, and whether I could step in to navigate the moment or to change the duet a little bit. But also very quickly, in retrospect, I think it seems as though as a choreographer, dancer, teacher, one has always had to navigate consent. It has shown up consistently in many forms. because we work with our bodies and because power structures operate between and among us as roles of performers, choreographers, audiences, I feel that we're consistently having to deal with what we agree to do and what we don't, who we're comfortable touching, what kind of touch we're comfortable with in any given moment, how many hours of work do we agree to do with our bodies, what fee do we agree to work for that particular work, how we'd like to be seen or represented in a performance work, and what we wear in a performance, and so on. So, I mean, I could go on, but I think because we work with our bodies, just the question of consent is alive at all times.
Everywhere, right? With every little thing that you do. Yeah. Neha, coming from, again, you are an artist, but you're also an intimacy director, which again, you might need to tell us a little bit about what that is, because it's so new for many of us. And then tell us, when was the first time that you encountered the idea of consent?
So I think for me, I've always sort of been drawn to the idea of consent and negotiation and setting boundaries, because as my early trainings as an actor were always about, actors should just be naked, right? There is this one line which is like, being an actor means standing, in front of an audience naked and turning around very slowly. And I think very often it is taken for like as is. Uh, and we're taught that, you are just a medium of art. And when I was creating work, I wanted to make a film and a piece, both simultaneously, which I was working on, which was talking about violence in the body, right? It's based on this thing called Body Keeps Score, right? And it was people I knew, people I've worked with, and yet there was no language of how to do this, how to make this happen safely, because it's a triggering topic. It's a topic that, all of us constantly are trying to grapple with, that, what is the gaze of this work? How do we make this work not feel visceral, and how do we make it feel like, someone needs to understand why this is problematic? um, and it took me back to a time when I had heard of intimacy choreography and worked with an intimacy choreographer with the Prague Shakespeare Company. And I just started training myself, because and when I started looking for like intimacy choreographers or intimacy directors in India, there were none. We're literally, like, even today, after like 1.5 years, we're just two of us right now in the country.
Yeah, yeah.
And in theater, I'm possibly the only one.
Mm.
Because obviously, like, film pays better, there are more avenues. In theater, there's no concept even today of intimacy direction. Like, you would choreograph, dance, you would say, oh, there has to be a movement, you would choreograph stunts, fight scenes. But in intimacy, you will tell the actors, improv, figure it out. So I think that is what started to bother me. And that's when I encountered that there has to be a better way to do this.
Yeah. Neha, I am going to come back to you with the use, very specifically, you use the word brave, sometimes instead of safe, and sometimes together with safe. So I'm going to come back to you as to what you mean by that. But getting back to Sharanya, you have actually worked in very different practices. You have been an urban city theater person. You went for years to train with Yakshagana artists and, sort of spent time in mostly male spaces of learning and teaching and performing, and then came back to make work together within the scope of urban theater. But more recently, you have also worked with sex workers, you have worked with trans women, and in each of these, they're so different also in the understanding of what consent might mean in that context, how it might be defined. So I wanted to understand from you, how do you negotiate this? How do you traverse between these three spaces, and share with us some experiences of on the floor, on the ground? I understand today a large number of our audiences for this session are from practices, and it'd be great to hear from you what happens on the floor in these very different contexts.
Right. Yeah, one thing that is pan across all contexts of performance art is that they are unsafe for women. It's a given. This is sort of the primary reason why we don't have women directors or performers, and most of them who did enter were historically marginalized women. So consent is not understood. And if it is understood in extremely narrow ways. So it's sort of, I think that's really the first thing that strikes me, when we talk about consent, that it doesn't exist, because unsafe is normal. It's to that extent it is normalized. For me, what is really interesting is spaces, which are specifically theater spaces. If you look at institutionalized theater spaces across, I will talk about across Karnataka, because that's really where I have really done a lot of my work. Many of them, invariably, and I'm sure this is pan-India, are constructed, safety in any way is always constructed around male morality. They are not constructed around female safety. Nan kai hakala, we are not that type of men, is really where it is placed. So for me, really the greatest danger of this is, women know how to navigate unsafe spaces from the minute they're born, so it's something that's inbuilt in you. You've normalized it from a large extent. But what is really dangerous is, for me, is throwing out the baby with the bathwater. If spaces are not constructed around female freedom and female desire and female sexuality and around male morality, you are not going to have a theatrical experience. You're not going to be involved in the world, because it is a censored way of living. I want to share with you one experience of this. For example, while learning Yakshagana. So I was in Yakshagana Kendra in Udupi, 2014-15, couple of years living in a space which had, men from 8-year-old boys to 70-year-old men. It was, so we were living, training, traveling, performing together, for this 2-year period. And green rooms, rehearsal spaces, just bodies like constantly, and I'm pretty much the only female body that is in that space. That's
open spaces, right? They're not like covered green rooms.
Yes. And these green rooms, where we performed, because they would be done in the night. So it would be, makeup would start from around 6 o'clock, and then we would be performing till 6 in the morning. So that's pretty much how it's set up. And all of the green room spaces are open spaces as well. So public can come in. And for me, that space actually felt so safe, because all of this was in the public domain. And the men there, the people there, had not made up their minds about what to do with me, so they didn't know what to do with the female body. So therefore, it gave me such a wonderful space to navigate. It was not yet constructed around male morality. It was still like, what do we do with this woman and what is going on here?
It was almost as if like male morality was not required in that space because female bodies weren't there.
Yes, exactly. So they never had to account for this. Yeah. So, but I see in a traveling theater troupe, like for example, Ninasam, the women who are there constantly talk about the harassment that they face when they have to change clothes. A green room is a highly sort of space of great harassment, where they have to close their doors and windows, have saris put up so that no one sees them. But that was not the case at all. So I feel like there is a great need for us to center spaces, because safety is really safe from who, right? So I feel like that's where it should center on, this conversation. And also the idea of female desire or risk, arousal, desire is always at that border of risk, but it's risky to what extent, right? And until those conversations are constructed around female freedom, it's going to end up always not being the experience you want.
And being about the moral position of the binaries of consent,
absolutely,
spectrum of desire. Before we move on to our next expert, there's one area. So you have yet again, your more recent work in research is to do with women theater makers who were comedians in the Kannada theater community, right? And here again, you are as we were chatting, you're dealing with a whole new kind of consent understanding. So share a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, so for me, it was always so interesting, Kannada, watching Kannada cinema as I grew up, watching, and it was always such a deeply disappointing experience when you try as an 8-year-old to find yourself in the leading heroines, because they all get chased and tamed, and they give birth after their first nights, and it's just terrible. I'm like, oh my God, I don't want to grow up to be one of these. And for me, I always identified and found myself in the comic frontline women, like an Uma Shri, a Mala Shri, these women who were just, vulgar. They knew their sexuality. They knew how to deal with the world.
Free, right? They're seen as sexy and free.
Yes, the sexy and free
structures, yeah.
Absolutely. And they are not the vamp. They are not the younger sister who gets raped and therefore the hero becomes the hero. They are not any of these stock characters. They are just independent sort of frontline women. And I was so interested because they really lit up my world as an 8-year-old. And when I was later searching for them, thinking of what is my legacy as a theatre maker in Kannada culture. And then I realized that this comes from company theatre. It comes from a company legacy. These are a group of frontline comic women who have constructed characters which center vulgarity. They are lewd. They talk about brinjals and the size of, the freshest brinjals in town. They talk about, all sorts of stuff on stage, which is layered in innuendo. And these are accepted, not just in circles of men who come to watch them, but this is sort of a acceptance into a middle class sort of world, families and women and men, everyone comes to watch this. This is a sort of a understood way of dealing with rebellion and within a patriarchy,
So in the making, how do they negotiate the patriarchy within which they work? Because how are they seen and how do they negotiate that gaze? The ideas of their consent, how complicated is that?
Absolutely. It's a really tricky space, because none of them identify as feminist. None of them see this as here I am doing Strivada. That is not part of how they negotiate their sort of art. But in the way that it's constructed and the fact that they are free of the narrative that a main stage heroine has to carry. Here, they're just making fun, and they're going to use their sexuality as a way of making fun. They're going to use the fact that they are extremely attractive to the opposite sex as a way of making fun, so it's all of these where that borderline of where that dance with patriarchy and that defiance is so gray. But it's unmistakable because you see it and it's there, and I find this sort of, public attention grabbing in public within a patriarchy, within the strictures of a patriarchy, so interesting. It's sort of almost a rebellion against its strictures by performing.
Just seeing that, by just performing that way.
And dancing with it, I'm saying, oh, I like you, but I don't like you. I'm going to do this. I'm going to talk about your, your organs. And I'm not. Oh, it was actually just, you misunderstood it. This sort of dance that's constantly happening. Wow. Yeah. That's right. Mirrored very much how women actually live in the patriarchy. They're constantly dancing with it, because your life depends on it very often.
Yeah. Thanks, Sharanya, for that. And I will come back to you with the idea of the public, the spectrum of consent, and sometimes the freedom and the vulgarity that produces a space within which more negotiations can be done. But now let us move to Mandeep. Mandeep, you have been a dancer yourself. You've choreographed production, directed, made new stuff, but you've also been a teacher. You've been teaching quite regularly, and many of your work has dealt with themes that push boundaries of sexuality, identity. Now, in this kind of space, which is already complicated, and I'm saying before Article 377 and after, because I'm sure that has also changed the spaces within which you work. How has this experience of ideas of consent been for you in your practice?
So I'm just going to talk about the way in which consent sort of surfaced many times over and became a kind of thing for us to work with through this process of making queen size.
Okay.
Which is a work I made in response to Section 377 that criminalized homosexuality in India for over 150 years. Queen size deliberately sort of brings the audience up close and quite close to intimacy between two male bodies as a kind of embodied argument against this archaic law. The work is an argument for consensual desire through a choreographic study of intimacy. So I want to share a short video of the work so that people have a sense of, what the work was before I begin to talk about the several ways in which we navigated consent through the process of making and performing the work.
Okay. Let's see this.
So, so I wanted to just start by saying that we started the process really in the deep end. One of the first tasks we set up in the studio was to look at a website that archived 108 gay sex positions. And we began to sort of embody these positions in the studio with the two performers who had come into the work through a process of workshopping, Lalit Khatana and Parinay Mehra. And among the two performers, we immediately encountered this question of which positions were we naturally sort of comfortable taking on. And there was some that, one of them would sort of simply refuse to do. And I also began to kind of spot a trend. The heterosexual dancer was comfortable only taking on the role of the top, someone who prefers the insertive role as opposed to the receptive one. Apart from those kinds of tensions, in the beginning, I began to also encountered this tension between what my intention as a choreographer was to say with the work and the dancers' own sort of discomfort with how they were being represented through the work. So in a sense, we were all uncomfortable in the beginning, so I had this concern that, am I making pornography? What's the point? Isn't there enough porn in the world? Can I just sort of direct people to the porn and make a point? There was a dancer who was, worried that he was being represented as a gay man, even though he wasn't. Perhaps the other dancer, he brought up this thing of, does performing in the work mean that I'm coming out as a gay person? So there was a kind of common concern that we all had. What if my family watches this work? So there were several conversations we had at different points to address many of these concerns. We went and watched Aligarh together, I remember, so that we could sort of begin to think about, what does this work mean to all of us together? But I think there were also concerns that we had to work through within the process as the process continued. So one of the dancers confessed to me way after the premiere that 3 weeks into the process, he had left his home one morning to come to rehearsal to tell me that he didn't want to be part of the work. So he was very uncomfortable, and by the time he got to the studio, he had decided to stay with the work for another week. And fortunately for all of us, within that week, I asked him to build a cart for the work, the charpai, because I'd seen it at his place and I knew that he made them. So, and he confessed to me months later that actually it was through the making of the charpai that he began to feel part of the work and decided to stay on. There was also this other discomfort, we knew that we had to deliberately construct intimacy. It was clear as day that intimacy wasn't real between these two performers, or that even if it was real, no intimacy can actually sustain itself in a performance of a work or making of a work. Then how do we construct it deliberately and how do we perform it? So we kind of had to sort of navigate this discomfort that proximity and touch produced in us in any given moment. And I remember one of the dancers sharing a beautiful way that he had discovered to get over this discomfort of touching or being in proximity with another male body, was that he began to experience touch not as I touch you or I touch him, but as a kind of experience of another surface through the skin. He began to sort of think about, what does this surface feel like? What is this texture? Can I experience it slowly? Can I experience what happens when I sort of do it quickly? So he begins to really experience it through constructs of time and space. And it also became very clear what each of the performers was most certainly uncomfortable with. So while one was uncomfortable with mouth-to-mouth contact, the other was opposed to full nudity, and they were quite vocal about that. And both were quite uncomfortable at several points with their genitals being touched directly.
Right.
Sometimes we would have conversations about these discomforts, but very often, and also change the scope of the tasks, but very often these discomforts would also simply play themselves out in the way that the work would get performed.
Develop and form, yeah.
Yeah, and so the last thing I want to talk about is also the kind of way in which the question of consent entered the structure of the work. As a work that makes an argument for consensual desire between two bodies, it was quite clear actually to me as a maker that choice needed to somehow become a structural device. It needed to be visible, it needed to be shared. So as I watched a kind of draft of the work early on with a small set of invited audience members, I realized that the dancers looked like they were being forced to do these actions, because the work was fully choreographed and they had to simply execute the steps. So I began to sort of rethink about how choice can be distributed between us. In perhaps all the elements in the performative space, including the performers, audience members, the lighting, score, the sound, could they be all sort of independent of each other and make their own choices? Could each of these elements retain their agency in a sense, and could consent then become visible in the work? So we arrived at a structure where the performers began to structure the work in negotiation with each other. So they would, in a loop over 2.5 hours, they would make choices about how to order the fragments, and they would negotiate with each other to say, no, we're not going to do this one now, we're going to do this one. And the work was also structured in a way that the audience members could enter, leave, re-enter, make choices about how long they want to watch for, what they, and where do they want to watch the work from close or proximity or far away, whether they could sit and stand while they watch, or whether they could watch it through a window or a door very often, because it gave them a kind of safety shield to watch the work through. So as a work that perforates the boundaries between performers and audience members due to sort of the close proximity between them, where the performers very often touch the audience members and vice versa. So that happened very a lot, that the audience members would begin to also touch the performers. The work relied very heavily on making the idea of choice and consent quite palpable in the room, so that all of these negotiations were visible to everyone in the room. In a sense, what it sort of called for was to make everyone's gaze and everyone's desire for contact or a kind of repulsion from contact accountable and visible. So everyone was lit so that we could see these negotiations play out. And in a sense, this work also becomes a kind of continual performance of consent.
So here I had one question, and when you were here in Bangalore with the work, I saw it in a very intimate space actually. And one of the things that I had thought is that, like we say in the idea of consent in relationships, that it cannot just begin with a yes. It is a continuous process of giving consent to a process of relationship, of intimacy. Now, when an actor or a director, when you decide to make a piece of work, how does the continuation of consent play out? Because you don't always know what you're consenting to, right? So is that like a regular everyday check-in? Practically, what are some of the things that you used for queen size to make this between the who's making the work and the actors, a space that is a continuous agreement, that the agreement and boundaries are being drawn and redrawn continuously, because it may change tomorrow, right?
Yeah. I think actually in the, because this was a work that we performed so many times, I've never performed with no other work that I have made, we've been able to perform that many times.
Right.
And we're touching now already some 85 performances, heading towards 100. And each time there's each time it gets performed, it's also 3 loops of the work. Every time we went into a performance or a rehearsal, it was also quite clear that the work kept shifting. So they would, I, in a sense, became a kind of respondent to the work. I would sort of say, okay, this is what I see today. And very often we would, and it wasn't always me, but we would propose things that could produce a spark again, because really it became mechanical quite quickly. Every 5 shows, it was turning mechanical. So we began to sort of think of, and we had to find new ways each time, actually, because the old ways kind of stopped working. So we had to sort of think about, and these suggestions came from the dancers most often, because they knew the work. They knew what it meant to keep the work alive. And they know when the work is dead, they can feel it. So very often these conversations would happen to say, what is it that we're willing to try out now? Do we want to try out a kind of focus today only on an eye contact that's playful, perhaps, and see what happens? Or could we today play with speed, that we surprise each other with speed? That you expect me to be slow here, but I'm going to be fast. And that the whole work sort of becomes a negotiation of speed. And so on. So we came up with hazard strategies to sort of keep it alive, but it was always in dialogue with the performers, and to know that that I could only actually respond as a viewer eventually after the work was made, but it needed to come from the performers, all of the sort of strategies to keep it alive.
And just one last bit before we move to, it's a very interesting way to shift to Neha from you, because you're moving from the making of a very, very intimate performance to talking to an intimacy director. But just one last question, how conscious were you, or what did you have to do to sort of, because as a director, you had a certain power, right? You had a certain power that's not just vested to you in within the tradition of making work, but also the space and the people that you work with, etc. How did you negotiate that part when it came to this idea of consent? Because if there was an artistic decision or an aesthetic decision that depended on, because that's where the crutch is, right? Depends on a question of consent. What is your negotiation there? How conscious were you of the power that you had to put on people who you were making this work with?
So the thing with these 2 performers is that I've known them for a long time, which means that we have a kind of relationship which is which in a way is also yes, of course, it's power ridden. It's I'm the choreographer and so on. So I'm aware of the fact that there is a dynamic there that maybe sometimes they don't want to say no to me. So I would certainly check in twice sometimes about things, but also be very, very willing to hear a no. Like I remember asking after the premiere, I remember asking whether just to even test out in one show whether we could try out full nudity, because I wasn't quite sure whether the work just going down to the underwear, what that did to the work, and I didn't know whether only by looking at the work in full nudity perhaps one could see whether that works or not. But so I placed that on the table, and there was so one of them was very excited, saying, yes, I've done it before and I will do it again. Yeah, I'm quite excited. But the other one, there was a very clear no, saying, no, I can't do it. And it was like, it's not even a negotiable for me, because I think, the work rests on those performers. And there is, so I didn't ever sort of push them to do something that I could hear a clear no for.
Right.
And so, yeah, that's how the relationship also developed over time, that it was a kind of intimate relationship where we knew we were all uncomfortable, you know, and we could sort of just, in a sense, also just sort of gauge how to make sure that we could all be comfortable somehow through this process.
Thanks, Mandeep. I hope at some point there is some, I mean, if there's some documentation on the making of this work, I think it'll be such a great learning experience for so many of us working in this area. Maybe at some point you'll think about either writing about it or, so thanks for that. I'll come back to you. I would like to now move to Neha. Neha, it's a very interesting moment when you're coming on. We just talked about Queen Size, which is, according to me, one of the most intimate performances, even as an audience, that one has seen. And so I wanted to ask you, you wear two hats, two distinctly different hats in some ways. One is that of an artist, you're a theater performer, maker. On the other hand, you work as an intimacy director, where your role is that of a facilitator, catalyst, perhaps. And how do you traverse this space through the idea of consent, and how do you make meaning?
Honestly, for me, I think being an artist allows me to be in their shoes, right? It allows me to acknowledge that as artists, as creators, there are no binaries, right? I feel like we are constantly binding ourselves in binaries. There is a yes or there is a no. But there is a yes, there is a maybe, and there is a no. And between the yes and the maybe, there is, oh, I am curious about this and I want to challenge myself. And between the maybe and the no, there is, I have to do this, I should do this. Or do I really want to do this? If I don't do this, then someone will feel bad, right?
Many shades of maybe also. There's so many shades of maybe.
Yeah. Exactly. So I always find it fascinating when I'm working with artists to put myself in their shoes, to understand that how do I navigate this spectrum of consent? How do I, and the only thing that I keep coming back to is an awareness of boundaries, an awareness of where this resistance is coming from as an artist, right? Or a creator. Is the resistance coming from a conditioning, or conditioning, societal conditioning, or morality, or nurture? Is it coming from perception? How will people look at me? What is it going to build for me? Or is it coming from trauma? Is it coming from a trigger or an experience that has defined this? If it is conditioning, if it is societal, if it's moral, we negotiate, we talk about it, we put it out, we have discussions, we workshop it. If it's about perception, we understand why this perception matters. Who is driving this perception? What is this invisible power that is constantly looming over artists of perception, right? And if it is trauma and it's something that's triggering, then there is a whole process of healing. There's a process of understanding, oh, this is where we don't go at all. And this is a hard one. But in my experience of like the last few years working, the biggest challenge is the awareness of boundaries. Because itni deep conditioning ho gayi hai, people have conditioned us to believe that artists must not have boundaries. Artists have to be open to all, and that boundaries are limited.
Detrimental, actually. They're limiting to your talent and to what you can do on stage. Yeah. I
like to subvert that idea because I say boundaries can be so much more empowering. They tell you what you can navigate, because especially for something like intimacy, we were Mandeep was talking about comfort and discomfort, right? That discomfort shows, right? If you're trying to tell a story of discomfort, great, use it, right? But if you're not, then if there is no conversation, if the communication is not clear, if the boundaries have not been processed, then it is always going to look jarring. It's almost, you will constantly feel like a voyeur in the room, not a part of the experience and not a part of the experience.
So Neha, I want to ask you here very specifically about this word brave that you use, creating
Yes.
brave spaces. And I was listening to your interview where you make a case for a brave space, not as opposite to a safe space, but as something more than a safe space is what I understood. Share with
Yes.
us a little bit, and maybe with a little bit of an example for some of us who may have come to it more fresh. We're just beginning to think about it. So what is a safe space and what is a brave space?
I think so. For me, the way I look at brave spaces internationally started off with this idea that in any space we cannot take responsibility for each other's safety,
Mhm.
right? You cannot take responsibility for absolute safety because you have no idea what's going to trigger a person. You do not know, especially when you're entering a new space. You do not know what makes someone tick, you
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
or what is the fear that they carry, where are they operating from. And then without the intention of causing harm, you can cause harm,
Mhm.
right? And then the space suddenly becomes unsafe
Mm,
because again you are navigating between safe and unsafe.
mm,
There is no in between. The idea of a brave space is that there is a spectrum,
mm.
and the what the system or the patriarchy has done is that they have introduced guilt,
Yeah.
they have introduced shame,
Yeah, yeah,
and they have taken away choice.
yeah.
What a
And
brave space!
with it desire
Yes,
also. Yeah, yeah.
absolutely. So, what a brave space does is it tells you that we cannot guarantee that this space is going to be safe for you.
Mm,
But I am going to guarantee that when you walk into this room, uh, you are going to be able to hold someone accountable
mm,
without shaming them.
mm,
You are going to be able to address your concerns without feeling guilty about it.
mhm,
And you always have a choice to step back,
mm.
right?
Yeah.
And then each community, so for example, I do a small course at DSM for the students and for the faculty,
Mm,
and they were actually the first ones to sort of get me on to have
mm,
this
mm,
conversation. And we created a system with the faculty that every time they would start work for a particular module,
mm.
they would have a brave space agreement
Right.
where
Yeah.
there would be points where, and there's a whole process where you have a whiteboard and you write down what brave means to you, and then you break down what space means to you,
Mm,
right? And then what allows you to be brave,
mm,
and marry the space. Now, space can mean the people, the
mm,
space can mean the room,
mm,
the space can also mean, if it's a physical practice, then that practice itself can become space,
mm,
right?
mm,
So, breaking the idea of what space means,
mm,
breaking the idea of what allows you to be brave and what brave means,
mm,
right? And then merging it together to build a little agreement,
mm,
which we then print
mm,
and we put it up in the classroom.
mm,
And it's sort of like a memorandum of understanding
mm.
between the participants and the faculty that allows you to know that I can hold something accountable.
Okay.
That there is,
Yeah.
we are building a tangible basically, right?
Mm,
Like there are tangible things that I am going to expect.
mm,
There are tangible things that
mm,
uh, I can respond to or
mm,
react to.
mm,
Whereas in safe space, I think it's a very broad sort
mm,
of idea. You have to feel safe
mm,
and you can feel unsafe.
mm. True.
And we've built a box.
Mm,
And I always feel like I was listening to the conversation. Consent is a conversation.
mm,
Boundaries are a statement.
mm.
So that conversation needs to happen constantly for artists.
Right.
The minute that we shut down conversation for the fear of someone else's safety.
Mm,
So we have to stop operating from fear in artistic spaces.
mm.
And that's why I feel like brave is the right word to use.
To use, yeah.
Uh,
So Neha, you were my last question in this round of our conversation is, you said at the very beginning, you were saying that as an artist, because you can put yourself in the shoes of other artists and it gives you a way to understand perspective. Do you think sometimes that it could, or okay, let me put it this way, what allows you to not make it limiting? Because each one of us, our own backgrounds, our own experiences, our own notions of life and our power positions place us in a particular point, no, in this kind of canvas that we're talking about. So is it detrimental for you to think of yourself, putting yourself in that place, because what you bring may be hugely different in the power dynamics than the artist? Because often when we are thinking of younger artists and say older directors, let's make it even younger women artists and older male directors, the power just gets polarized further and further, right? So how do you deal with this question of this memorandum of understanding in a place like that, which is obviously set up in the worst possible unjust way? How do you begin a conversation there?
I usually take power dynamics head on. I usually start with the conversation that in any room that we exist in, there is a visible power and the invisible power, and that we have to acknowledge that the people in this room carry some visible power and some invisible power.
Right.
And then I think in my practice, what I've experienced is that as soon as you start acknowledging and giving words to experiences or to the existing systems, they become far more negotiable.
Right.
Right? Like when you're working with bodies, right? Talking about breasts and calling them breasts, right? Talking about vulva and calling it the vulva, and being specific about, this is the, bicep area, and this is the forearm area, and this is the hand. The more specific you get, the sharper you are able to address boundaries.
Right.
And I always, there is a very interesting set of parameters that are globally used for an understanding of consent. And those I always lay out. They are basically called fries, as in the fries that we eat, which is, I love that they're called fries. But so the F stands for freely given. That at any point that you start to feel that I am not freely giving this consent, you have to take a step back and rethink. Right? There is R, which means reversible. That any point in the process, this consent is reversible. Right? And I can communicate that reversal. I, which means informed. That means that every time an artist is giving consent, a creator is asking for consent, they have provided the whole spectrum of information
available at that point. Yeah.
Right? E, which is empowered or engaged or embodied. Right? At all points when I am giving my consent, I have to feel engaged in the work. Right. I have to feel empowered. The space has to empower me to say, hey, I can assert a no. Embodied, to really pay attention to your body. A lot of responses of our body rest in the vagus nerve, which is which is what we call the gut usually, because it is built from the experiences that we've had in this lifespan that we've lived. So listening to those experiencing and being embodied. And lastly, specific. We always give consent to specific things. And I feel like once I introduce this, it usually takes everybody like a bit to like, oh, I have this choice. And I think the introduction of choice, the nod to the power dynamics, suddenly allows for the space to automatically become brave enough to discuss a brave space agreement.
Right.
So,
and so Neha, what I want to do now is just bring the others back at this point to our conversation, and look at each one of you have shared from your own perspectives, your own context, the different kinds of, just let me do this. Yes. The different ways in which you've identified, worked with the ideas of consent. How have there been situations, maybe you can share one such, starting with Neha, where boundaries have got blurred and you've had to take a step back and say, hey, now I don't know whether I'm, dealing with the idea of consent well or not. Now I'm confused. Has there been a moment of blurriness, confusion, maybe self-doubt in your own practices? And Neha, in your case, either as an artist or as an intimacy director.
I think for me, early on when I started working, I started encountering this interesting phenomenon
Mhm.
where a lot of the cis male performers would be like, if the girl is comfortable, I am.
Yeah.
You know, no, I don't. I mean, I'm good. Like, just
Mm.
take care of the woman, right? I don't want to be caught, you know, in a thing where the woman is uncomfortable. Like, I don't want, and the jokes about Me Too and everything will just like burst open in the space. And whenever I would ask them, but yeah, I understand, they have boundaries and you want to respect, but what are your boundaries?
Mm.
That question would just,
Itself is, yeah.
it felt alien
Mm.
because uh, my mother's a very, she comes from a Marwadi family. We're like, but she said something very interesting. She said that we are constantly working towards telling women that they need to own more space, and women themselves are fighting harder, right? However, we are forgetting to tell the men, especially cis men, that they too have to educate themselves, that they too have to, the emotional labor can't always be carried by the other genders,
Mm.
right? You have to partake equally in the emotional labor.
Mm.
And then to educate them that, hey, you can have boundaries too,
Mm.
right? So for me, initially, because you're wired to constantly think of the marginalized genders,
Mm.
I would constantly be like, early on, I would be like, okay, if he's, and then at one incident, uh, one of the cis males I was working with turned around and said, I don't know if I'm comfortable with this.
In this, yeah.
And the director said that, what is wrong with you? The woman is okay and you being a man are not okay. And it just, I think for me, uh, that made me also step back and relook at the way I look at
Mm.
performance spaces
Right.
and how sometimes I, as an intimacy director, may be creating that little where I am being more conscientious about the marginalized genders in the room
Mm.
and being a less maybe like, they're men, they're privileged,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And that privilege, obviously, in me as a woman, has brought in some dissent of the
Yeah.
privilege that cis males carry.
Yeah.
Uh, I often have to check that now
So you have to
in
be
the work.
conscious of, that. Yeah. And
Yes.
Mandeep, coming to you, have there been these moments of self-doubt or just one incident maybe where you felt you're not sure of what to do, or whether after doing something, whether it was done with consent, and where these ideas of consent has got blurred, perhaps?
Many times, actually. I think at some point I was just right in the beginning of the queen size process. I was just like, why have I taken this on? Because I really feel like I've set up something that is so muddy, and one has to sort of work through it in such a detailed way. And I wasn't prepared at all. I didn't realize that this is what I was kind of setting myself up for till we were in the studio in the first week. So maybe I think one of the things that I remember sort of like I was telling you, that one of the dancers was quite comfortable with certain positions, the positions that were of the top positions. So it was, for me, I think I kind of pushed him quite early on to see if he wants to try out the other position also, because I sort of began to feel like there was a kind of power dynamic now between the performers to say ye to tu kar pata hai, and I also realized that I was reading into it a lot, and it became kind of I wasn't quite sure whether this was about them or me anymore, where I was feeling like there was a kind of bottom shaming that was going on. So I kind of insisted, not insisted, but proposed, do you want to try this out? And, and I remember him saying, there was this one moment which was just so confused, and he's like, hey, yeah, of course I will try it out. And I remember going home and thinking, I may have to do this very differently, so that we're kind of easing into the process. Yes, we want to be able to push ourselves to experience things that are uncomfortable, because that's really the what we're setting up to do. And that was a conversation we had right in the beginning of the work. I remember a long conversation saying it is going to be very uncomfortable for you. Are you kind of willing to experience things that are uncomfortable? And of course, we didn't realize what the extent of that discomfort was going to be. So that was one such moment where I was just like, oh God, how do I navigate this? I'm not prepared.
I just noticed you use the word experience and discomfort and be uncomfortable as against submit to discomfort. I have heard a lot of makers talk about the word submit, and that often scares me a bit, because it is an inherently loaded word in the manner in which it is said. So yeah, I noticed how you pulled back from insisted, and how it's also in the language that we bring to the floor, right? Sharanya, moments of self-doubt, confusion, blurriness with yourself, or because you've made work with men, with cis men, cis women, with trans women, with very different kinds of sexualities, genders as well. So any moment of blurriness?
Yeah, all the time. And I think that's sort of is really the way to go, because you're not sure. You're not sure that this is it, this is the path. And even while working with trans women or sex workers or people, the language in the room is still sole munde, it's still like referring to each other as, it's even within the community, we have patriarchal language, it's sort of to say, guys, sex work is work, is sort of in that space is also important, because we're all in the language of patriarchy, so in that sort of way, it even working with the sexual minorities does not mean that you're not dealing with a kind of a patriarchal idea of consent. It permeates through, so it's sort of many times sort of re-understanding things together. Like, for example, even understanding of things like voice, I would say, to my actors and Nava, a bunch of trans women, I would say, you have to project your voice, and you realize that voice is gender, voice is identity, and you don't really want to project your voice into this depth, which is your theater exercise. And you realize, my God, theater exercises never took into account trans voices, so it's sort of like deconstructing it backwards and realizing spaces in which you perform in, people to whom which you perform in, they're all do not have your consent. I have to go into a space which is divided into a binary where an audience sits in the dark and performers are in the light. And I will refer this to what Mandeep said. He said he had lights on the audience throughout, but it's theater convention for us to switch that light off and the light comes on and we perform. All of these do not have our consent, and we just then it takes a particular kind of practitioner to sort of break that down, I want to specifically talk about one incident where I was really wondering, and I think I don't have answers to this, but I just wanted to leave it out there, was during the performance of Akshayambara, and Aru, the show is very sort of confrontational on this idea of gender, etc., and it really gets in there. And there's a point in the play where it's all high tension, and the male performer who plays Draupadi, and me who performs the Shasana, who's male female, all of that. And there's a point just before the climax where he slaps me across the face for saying, "What's the problem in menstruation?" And many times the audience breaks into applause. And it is a moment of, and before I go on stage each time, and this show has traveled nationally, internationally, locally, pretty much everywhere, but each time before I go, it's a moment of breakdown. I want to run away from theater. I don't want to face it. It's hard to go there. And I know the way I steel myself, and that, sort of, I'm holding back tears each time it happens. And I wonder, and I always think to myself, can I stop and say, leave. You can't watch my performance. Can I do that? I mean, at what extent do I have consent of an audience watching me? Do I always have to say everyone can watch me? Maybe not, So this is also one theater convention. You're like the show must go on. One of these violent things that we do. Should everyone watch me?
Yeah.
Is also a question of consent. I feel in the theater. Yes,
very, very interesting, because also I was thinking, as you were speaking of two things, we won't have time to talk about it, but one is when people work with children, and this has come up in our discussion. It's a whole different, we need another panel to discuss that, and what happens to consent when it is with children, and children both as audience and children as makers and performers. And the other thing is, who has consented to tradition? So these things that you talk about, Sharanya, like dimming the light or having a certain spatial arrangement with the audience or the audience's reaction, all these are also conventions and traditions, right? That you don't automatically realize you've signed on to when you've become a performer. And at what points do you have authority to break it? So consent and authority also gets into a conversation at that time. So, we have a lot of questions. So I do have one last question for all three of you, but I think I'll keep it till the end. Let's go through some of the questions that have come from the audience. They've been waiting for some time. So some of them are specific to some of you, and some are just open. So I'll go with the one. This is Sharanya to you. Samira Iyengar is asking, who are the writers for the women comedians? Are they men or women? While Sharanya was talking, I thought of the parallels with Lavani, where, however, the writers are men, and yet the voice we often experience is the Lavani woman performer, which is quite fascinating. Interested to know more.
Samira, great question. I think the answer to that is it's for me. I see it as a form. The frontline comic women for me is a form, because they started to write their own lines. So it's an improvised. No one writes lines for the comic woman because she's unimportant, and it is also always written for the heroine, because her heroine's lines are written so carefully in a way to maximize heroic potential. So nobody cares about the frontline, because she really comes in when the scenes change. It takes a long time in company theatre to put up sets and bring elephants on stage, etc. So she's going to go making fun till the moment is to leave, and the main stage opens. So she's improvising everything she's doing there, and it's not just one woman improvising. It's a bunch of women. It's a legacy and a lineage of women performers who built these sort of comic roles. So for me, that is what is most interesting, that they built it themselves.
Thanks, Sharanya. Mandeep, I'll come to you. There are two questions, one from Ajay Joshi and the other from Shivani Nag, and both deal with questions about the consent of the audience. So Ajay says, Mandeep, did you think of the audience and their reactions would be when you were creating Queen Size, their consent? Also, how do we negotiate with their artistic sensibility to see such interesting work? Raise their bar by taking a risk, he asks. Shivani is asking, hi Mandeep, I'm also thinking of consent from the position of the audience, especially in a more interactive form, from being just an active live audience presence to involving them in more tangible ways. Where do they, and also where they do not know what to expect? How is that imagined and negotiated? Now, Mandeep, I also know that on your own, you've done work which has been like public art and performed in all kinds of spaces, totally outside the boundaries of the proscenium, and even sort of smaller spaces. So can you connect these two and respond to the audience consent question?
Yeah, so maybe just starting by responding to Ajay's question, that in the beginning, I think I was, because I also saw myself as an audience member as I was making the work, and I kept inviting different audience members, so different people to come in and watch the work as it was being made. I was getting feedback from them all the time. So in a way, I think for me, for this work in particular, I knew I needed to sort of keep this sort of feedbacking process as part of making. And since then, I've kind of taken that on also as a kind of process that I built for myself, that I open up the work in sort of small bursts so that I'm able to gauge what the kind of reaction is. Because I think for Queen Size in the beginning, the idea was I'd sort of set up a work as a provocative work, and I realized through conversation with people that it was off-putting, that there was a kind of othering that happened in that exchange in the rehearsals, where the performers became different from the audience members, and it became queer activism very often can have that kind of othering that's attached to it. It's about their rights, and it's not about it's not them and us. So I began to sort of think about what are the ways in which this othering we can stop that from happening. Is it possible for the performers to also sit back and watch each other as if they were watching the performance also as audience members? Is it possible for the audience members as they walk into the space to already be performers because they're crossing the space, a kind of like this thin line of this is the performative space around the bed, but there are people walking. Sometimes they're touching it as well. So I began to sort of play with that a little bit and slowly, so that the work became less provocative and uncomfortable. But was it possible for me to also sort of handhold people into being able to watch something that is inherently uncomfortable for all of us, including me, because in the beginning, as I was watching, I was really uncomfortable. I was like, I had all these kinds of questions about what am I watching, and so on. So, and I knew that people were also thinking of that. So I did sort of think through it systematically somehow before we put the work out. And at some point, I began to also trust the process. And I think after about the 6th or the 7th performance, I realized that because we sort of performed it in big city Delhi and also small towns across the Northeast as our first sort of leg, it became quite clear that there was going to be a complex kind of reaction to it. There were some people who would leave the room. Very few actually would just leave the room, one or two maybe. In between a couple of evenings, or there would be people who will sit and watch the whole thing. They were uncomfortable in the beginning that they got. So there were all kinds of, there were types of gazes or types of experiences that I began to sort of archive through conversation with them. And I realized that actually wherever the work went, I began to trust that people have this tremendous capacity to experience something that they're uncomfortable with. And one has to trust that, because otherwise you sort of either make the work too safe or you start thinking differently about the work and so on. So I began to sort of trust this process, and I want to leave that there.
Thanks, Mandeep. I'll bring the next one, Neha, to you, though we did say that we are not going to, we won't have time to talk about underage actors or children. But if you could talk a little bit about this, because this has come from Prantik Narayan Basu. He's been watching us on Facebook. Hello, thank you for this enlightening and much needed discussion. My question is regarding working with underage teenage actors, performers. We consult the parents for their consent, but in some cases, the parents' opinion might differ from the underage artist, who are the partakers themselves. Could you please shed some light on how to negotiate such critical scenarios? Now, we understand you can't go into the details, but a little bit, if you point him to some resources which are there, maybe.
I think most importantly for children, what we now look at is dual consent, right? Which means that yes, the parent can consent, but the child, no matter what age, we have to learn to read cues of discomfort. We have to learn to start seeing beyond, like trust the vagus nerve, right? There is a organization called CPSH, if I'm not wrong. I am in fact working with them now. They international. So UK has really strong laws for minority consent, right? And if you start looking at their resources, you will realize that in the minor work, more and more internationally, people are looking at dual consent. And dual consent means that if there is an artist performing, you have a child psychology specialist have a certain set of interviews, has certain exercises before you introduce them to a performance space.
So the dual would mean the parents, but also the child in
Yes,
association with the child psychologist who brings
yes,
their opinions into fray. Yeah.
absolutely. And one of the resources, in fact, that I've shared, Consent Studio, which is something that the link is. Consent Studio is the Intimacy Directors and Coordinators International, which is my sort of alma mater. I studied with them in New York. They've started the Consent Studio where they have worked with child psychologists and child health practitioners to create programs for school children and high school children, which are now these one of the things that I'm working with IDC is to contextualize them to India because culture matters, right? I can't take those resources as is and apply it. But for someone who's interested in understanding consent for children, they are great resources to just look at them, to read up, to find out, the kind of programs that they've designed. I'm hoping that I can contextualize that to India and introduce consent in performance education early on.
Okay.
But
Thanks, Neha. Sharanya, I'll come back to you with another question. This is from Lapniang CM. Sharanya, in your practice, which space has been more accepting of intimacy coordination? Predominantly male-dominated spaces, female spaces, queer spaces. Have things changed since you began?
Have things changed since I began? I began, being a performer and directing 15 years ago. So yes, definitely. I almost feel like it's cyclic. Every 5 years, I see a change. Like a generation shifts, new language enters into spaces, but I do see a whole new type of theater that is sort of emerging now and has a language. I feel like so much of art, and you can feel it sort of first, I think, in the arts, the change in the world. I mean, as much as we live in such a divided, terrible times, you feel it in the water. You feel like the future is non-binary. You know it, and I feel that in this space, and I think that's the good news. The good news, I think, is that the press.
Yeah, there's a question that's come from Mangai, and this is not to any of you, so any of you can respond to this. How do you detect trans, homophobic, or even misogyny that seeps through the cracks under the garb of keeping boundaries? This discomfort may not be caused by any literal move, but just the heavy air around. Would any of you like to take this on?
I would just like to make a point to this. I don't know if I'm really taking it on, but I feel like we were speaking about language earlier, and language can become a huge tool for exclusion. And for us as practitioners to start using language that is not exclusive. For example, we're so wired to say, hey guys, or hello guys, or before the start of performance, versus using terms like folks, or people, or audience. I think the biggest perpetrator of homophobia and transphobia and queer othering has been language. The language that we start to address people with, how and labels. How do we want to constantly give something a box to live in? Through the work that I do, I've recognized that my gender is fluid. But before I started this work, and before I started questioning the ideas of binary, I hadn't even known that I can have an experience like that with my gender or my understanding of my body. So I think the way to sort of release the heavy air is to start introducing small language norms that are open rather than exclusive.
Here, I actually want to, add in something else. We are talking about gender and sexuality. We've been doing that through the session. And caste hasn't come up once. Whereas in India, actually, whenever we are talking about intimacy and touch, how can we not talk about caste, which is such an important, I was actually remembering something and I thought that one of the, what Mangai says is not just about misogyny, but it's also this whole thing about caste prides and who you will touch and who you will not touch, who you will be touched by and who you won't. And even in terms of breadth or proximity. So maybe if between the two performers, anybody want to take that up, and any incident or anything that you've experienced, taking on Mangai's question of homophobia, transphobia, or even, let's say, caste phobia.
I feel like these are, insidious. They are never called out because theater spaces are always, leftist, commie, sort of spaces. They are always have a veneer of the liberal, and therefore, religion doesn't matter, caste doesn't matter, but it does. And I think I would second what Neha is saying about language systems. It's the color of my skin. It's the way I speak Kannada in a particular way. You immediately know my caste location. It's a part of the way you even speak Kannada. It's they say speak properly means speak like a Brahmin. So it's sort of it's when it is so entrenched in this sort of way. How can we really separate it? I think it's a constantly evolving question, and I think sometimes just being aware all the time is the
only way. Yeah. Mandeep, I'll come back to you. There are two questions here again related to comfort, discomfort. So one is a question that's coming from Abhijit Mudgerikar. Says, the conversation on discomfort was quite interesting for the process of Peen Size. The play between what's comfortable and what's not in a performative space is also something I'm pondering on now. Did the verbal discussion on discomfort lead to newer forms of movement exploration? Or was it the other way around, where after movement exploration choreography, the discomforts were discussed and how did movement negotiate? Samira asks, did you pick up non-verbal cues from your performers to understand comfort, discomfort?
So it happened both ways, actually. It happened both ways where sometimes we would try something out and in the doing there was discomfort. And then it would lead to a conversation, maybe scrapping the idea altogether, or perhaps coming up with a kind of refined task that we were all comfortable with. Sometimes there would be discomfort also being expressed immediately after a kind of proposition that I would put forth. And so then we would discuss it and say, how perhaps we can do something else. So it was constantly through a dialogue, but as Samira says, actually reading non-verbal cues was actually a huge part of this process, because I've also now known them in this work for 7 years. And it's been, just the other day I was looking at a month ago when we were rehearsing it again, I was looking at how, after 2 years gap, they're suddenly looking aged, like not aged, but like I can see some gray hair. And I know those bodies so well that we're beginning to sort of say, there's some little gray here and some little balding here. So I think over time, we've also just developed a really intimate relationship, not just between, in the beginning, it was me and the performers individually. And there was a long period where the performers really couldn't get along with each other, actually. It was quite a difficult beginning to the, beginning 3-4 years were really difficult, because we were sort of, at some point we'd hit this moment where one of them wanted to leave because they were just not able to get along with the other person. So there was a kind of much like a relationship, there was a power dynamic, there was, there were dynamics of class that were at play. I could tell quite clearly that there was, so I remember sort of sitting down with one of the dancers and also sort of talking through why you have a certain kind of reaction to the other one.
Yeah.
Is it because of the kind of experience that he got, or lack of experience? Where is it coming from?
Yeah.
So I wanted to sort of like put this notion of difference in that conversation, because perhaps the discomfort was also coming from the fact that they were so different from each other and were judging each other for that difference and so on. So yeah, it sort of went into our entire team, including the sort of the producing sandbox team, jumping in and having individual conversations with them, and us having a collective conversation. We began to sort of resolve these differences. And now it's a very, very different relationship between the two of them. You see them sort of massaging each other in the free time and sort of, releasing a catch that may have happened and so on. So it's a very different relationship now. So you've come on full circle, really.
I'm actually thinking the question that Mangai asked, how do you detect homophobia, etc., which is couched under discomfort. Actually, what you're talking about, Mandeep, is having this discussion. The moment you start unraveling with somebody, feeling that what is this discomfort? Why are you uncomfortable? That I think could throw light into where it's coming from. Whether is it coming from a certain kind of phobia, socialization, conditioning, or where is it, or prejudice, for example. And I also know, Mandeep, that you not only picked up nonverbal cues from your actors, but also from audiences. To many audiences later, you told them what you saw them reacting to, and that I felt was very interesting. As the maker who's looking at audience with so much, and I think that's why you kept the lights on the audience, just to see how audiences would react. We have one more question here that has come from, this is also for Mandeep. It's a bit long. I'm just going to shorten it and ask. So this construction, this has come from someone called Toto Robin. So this construction of intimacy we were talking about, this capacity that we're trying to build through these conversations, is to abide productively with not knowing, to be able to respond to whatever gestures may be on offer, or simply to absorb the presence of another being. So I got reminded about the strange nature of this art form that we engaged in, and how we can be more inclusive in the function of this strangeness. I see usefulness in insisting on a sex and gender distinction in performers' bodies in order to work smarter with these negotiation in spaces. I wonder how Mandeep or other panelists think about this thought.
Yeah, maybe I just respond very quickly on this idea of strangeness, because I think very often we brought back into the space this question of actually never having seen each other or known each other. Because there was a kind of, when there's a bodily comfort or familiarity, it became in a way, which is also nice to watch sometimes, but also sometimes it was quite disruptive to a kind of freshly played out intimacy. So this question of, is it possible for us to be in the space as if we've never met the other person, and that we're encountering each other for the very first time, and we're touching each other for the very first time? What happens then? So these kinds of sort of scenarios we have to sort of keep bringing up. And the other kind of strangeness that we did bring up in the process was also sometimes to think of ourselves not as human beings, but as material, as form, as sort of life form sometimes, so there's a sort of section of hands playing with each other in the work. And I remember we all sort of, and from a feedback we heard very early on from an audience member that, it looks like a life form rather than a human form. It looks like, some sort of seaweeds playing with each other and so on. We began to sort of also propose this thing of, is it possible to then imagine these bodies not as human, but as sometimes becoming creatures, sometimes sort of becoming six-legged creatures or eight-legged creatures and so on. So we did begin to play off that kind of strangeness.
And the shadows were helping. I remember the shadows would help with that
kind of strangeness. Yeah, making things unfamiliar, actually. That was really quite useful as a strategy to say, why play on the familiarity of an action, but actually make it unfamiliar so that we can start somewhere else when we look at it fresh,
Start
afresh
afresh.
again. Yeah.
So those were the questions from the audience. So I have one last sort of ending this session with this last question. That so where from here, where do we go? And maybe very shortly, all three of you connect to a couple of things that you think we should do as practitioners, as supporters of spaces that are safe and brave. How do we put this in action? A couple of things that make us, especially people in authority, directors, etc., should think about, should know, should put in practice, that should become part of culture, or things that actors, performers, cast and crew should keep in mind. A couple of things that for the future that will create more nurturing spaces. Sharanya, I'll begin with you, and just a few thoughts on that.
Sure. I think it's almost like you see new text being written for the new brave performance space, and you see so many commonalities across it. I think I'm just going to point to a few that I see from my own continuing practice and what I sort of see other queer feminist sort of open spaces doing. One, I always see that they are non-hierarchical. They sort of completely reject this idea of hierarchy. Works are co-created. Many of them in their formats are post-dramatic. We are done with the dramatic structure, we're done. And it doesn't really serve anything. So all of these have this sort of format. And I think this creation of material based on body, that's sort of really another feature that I see. I just want to, for example, there was a friend of mine, a dear friend of mine who's a Kannada theatre maker, and she was calling me from, she was going to get an abortion in the next half an hour, and she just needed to chat with someone. And I remember, this conversation that we were having, and we were thinking, amongst things saying we should make a rap song which embeds the numbers of, people that you can call who are safe for you to get an abortion. And we were laughing about these things. And then we were thinking, we must create a fund, because she was just talking about how it is a minimum 10,000 rupees to get one. She said, as a working artist, how do you get this? So I think these conversations sort of starting from these associations really, which make spaces brave, so I'll pass it on from here, but definitely there are these features that I constantly see.
Yeah, Neha, I'll move to you. Some thoughts on?
I think for me, the most important bit is introducing the ideas of consent education in performance education, in spaces of performance. Like, I found it so fascinating when Sunil sir called me in and he said, I want you to do a workshop for actors and directors and theatre makers to know what it means to be a consent-informed artist or consent-forward artist. I think just introducing these conversations, introducing language, vocabulary about consent, about understanding of boundaries, about the fact that this needs to exist, and dismantling power structures in performance. That has to be an active effort from anybody and everybody who's involved in creating performances, being a part of performances, or in fact funding performances, right? Because like in film, a lot of producers and platforms are taking on the mantle of like advocating for intimacy professionals. And more importantly, I think we need more people to train in consent advocacy in performance spaces, because it's such a crucial training in the times that we live in. And I mean, it always just really breaks my heart that I'm possibly the only one right now. So I think for me also the mandate is to be able to, like, whatever I have learned, whatever I can, to just sort of pass on that knowledge and that skill set.
Thanks.
That's what I
Thanks
think.
so much, Neha. Mandeep, a few thoughts?
Yeah, I was just actually, as I was listening, I was recounting a kind of conversation we had couple of years ago, where you and I were speaking about how a performance space or the process of making a performance, whether that performative space can become truly democratic. whether it's even possible to make it democratic, because power equations exist in the way that performance is set up, right? Someone watching, someone doing, someone has the power to do, someone's lit, someone's in the dark, so on and so forth. Someone's higher, someone's lower, someone can speak, someone can't speak, and so on. So yeah, I think it's no less of a kind of thought that puts down. So the other part of me is, of course, thinking that you create safe spaces, and you create spaces for work that have clear processes for redressal in case of a complaint, regular dialogue around consent, listening circles that create safe spaces for intimate conversations, and also sort of consistently listening in as makers and performers about the ways in which power plays out within these roles.
Right.
At the same time, also, while we are thinking about making work to see whether those power structures can, like Sharanya was saying, can actually truly be challenged and be undone through the process of making, whether that's even possible. But yeah.
Thanks, Mandeep. A big thank you to all three panelists, Neha, Sharanya, and Mandeep, for sharing so much of your experiences, your vulnerabilities, as well as some of the thoughts to take this forward. I would like to also thank again the Getty Institute, Max Muller Bhavan, New Delhi, for making this possible. A big thank you to Sunil Shanbag, who's been my partner in crime in setting up this panel. Thanks so much, Sunil, and to the SMART team, that's Samira Iyengar, Menika Rodriguez, Neil Chaudhary, and Ashish Mehta in the core team, and Rupali Vaidya and Darshana Dave, who make this whole thing come alive for us and manage the program. A huge round of applause for the audience for bringing with us, for asking us those questions. And from our side, I was just thinking that we keep listening to each other, we keep listening to each other's issues, concerns, problems, desires, help each other make the boundaries we need to, help each other break the boundaries we need to. And let's work towards a more safe and brave space for the arts. There has been, I can see in the audience, requests for, can we do this with children's work? Can we do this kind of a discussion with music? And we hope that if there is any group out there who would like to get to know how to put something like this together, we can share our thoughts with them. So get in touch with us and let's make this happen. Thank you very much. Shabba khair to everyone.